Between 2012 and 2016, Nintendo's market capitalization collapsed from roughly $32 billion to $22 billion. That's close to $10 billion in shareholder value destroyed in just 4 years. The culprit wasn't a lack of effort, it was a £100 tablet controller attached to a console nobody wanted, the Wii U, a platform that sold just 13.5 million units over its entire lifespan, compared to the Wii's 101 million. But here's what makes this interesting. The Wii U wasn't designed to fail. It was designed to protect something Nintendo considered more valuable than sales figures themselves, their hardware moat. This is a story about what happens when protecting your business model becomes more important than adapting it, when the incentive to defend yesterday's advantage blinds you to tomorrow's threat, and why sometimes the very thing built to keep you safe becomes the layer that breaks first. The hardware fortress. To understand why Nintendo bet so heavily on the Wii U's peculiar design, you need to understand the structure that made them dominant for decades. Nintendo's power didn't come from making brilliant games, though they did. It came from controlling the entire stack. Hardware, software, distribution, all of it. In the 1980s and 90s, this vertical integration was a fortress. If you wanted to play Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon, you bought Nintendo hardware. If you were a developer, you paid Nintendo's licensing fees, manufactured cartridges through Nintendo's facilities, and followed Nintendo's approval process. This wasn't just about profit margins, it was about control. Control over quality, control over supply, control over the entire player experience, and it worked brilliantly. For 20 years, Nintendo's hardware-software integration generated extraordinary returns. The Game Boy alone sold 200 million units. The Nintendo DS moved 154 million. But by 2006, the structure that made Nintendo powerful began showing cracks. The iPhone launched in 2007. The App Store arrived in 2008. Suddenly, gaming wasn't locked to dedicated hardware anymore. It was everywhere. In your pocket, on your tablet, distributed digitally at near zero marginal cost. The Wii's motion control gimmick had bought Nintendo temporary breathing room, 101 million units sold, but by 2010 sales were cratering. Casual players who'd bought Wiis for Wii Sports had moved to smartphones. Hardcore gamers never fully bought in. Nintendo's leadership faced a choice: adapt to the new market reality. Multi-platform distribution, digital ecosystems, reduced hardware differentiation, or double down on what had always worked: hardware exclusivity. They chose protection over adaptation. The Wii U strategy. In June 2011, Nintendo revealed the Wii U. The centerpiece wasn't the console itself, it was the gamepad. A tablet controller with its own screen meant to deliver asymmetric gameplay that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. The logic was elegant, at least internally. If Nintendo's power came from hardware exclusivity, then the Wii U needed a feature so differentiated that players would have to buy Nintendo's box to experience it. The gamepad was that feature, but differentiation came at a cost. The gamepad added an estimated £50 to £80 to the Wii U's manufacturing expenses. That meant the console had to launch at £250 to £300 just to avoid selling at a loss, a price point that positioned it awkwardly between the aging Xbox 360 and the incoming PlayStation 4. Worse, to keep costs remotely manageable, the console's actual processing power was barely ahead of 7-year-old hardware. The Wii U's GPU was roughly equivalent to the Xbox 360's. Its CPU was slower. This created an impossible situation for third-party developers. The Wii U had a unique controller that required custom development work, outdated hardware that couldn't run next-gen multi-platform games, and an install base of 0. So they didn't support it. EA, Activision, Ubisoft, everyone who'd reluctantly supported the Wii, abandoned the Wii U within 18 months. By 2013, the Wii U's software lineup was almost entirely first-party Nintendo titles, which might have been fine, except Nintendo's internal studios couldn't produce games fast enough to sustain a platform alone. The incentive structure was eating itself. The incentive trap. Here's where it gets interesting from a structural perspective. Nintendo wasn't stupid. They had smart people, market data, and decades of experience. So why did they build a platform with such obvious contradictions baked in? Because their incentive stack demanded it. Layer 1, hardware margins. Nintendo had always made money on hardware sales, unlike Sony and Microsoft, who often sold consoles at a loss and made it back on software and services. Abandoning hardware differentiation meant abandoning those margins. Layer 2, software control. Nintendo's first-party titles had attach rates of 60 to 70%. If they went multi-platform or embraced digital-first distribution, they'd lose control over pricing, release timing, and the player relationship. Layer 3, institutional identity. Nintendo's entire corporate culture was built around hardware innovation. The Game & Watch, the D-pad, the analog stick, and motion controls, hardware breakthroughs defined them. Admitting hardware differentiation no longer mattered would require redefining what Nintendo was. Layer 4, leadership risk aversion. The people making these decisions had built their careers on the old model. Proposing a strategic pivot to multi-platform or digital first meant admitting the structure they'd built and defended was now a liability. So they didn't pivot, they protected hardware margins by making the gamepad mandatory, even though it added cost and complexity. They protected software control by keeping everything exclusive, even though it meant launching with almost no third-party support. They protected institutional identity by doubling down on hardware innovation even though the market had moved on. Every layer of the incentive stack pointed toward the same decision: build a differentiated, controlled, hardware-exclusive platform, which is exactly what made the Wii U doomed from the start. Why protection failed? The Wii U launched in November 2012 into a market that had fundamentally shifted beneath Nintendo's feet. Mobile gaming revenue grew from $6 billion in 2010 to nearly $30 billion by 2015. Players weren't asking for unique controller gimmicks, they were asking for convenience, accessibility, and games that went with them everywhere. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One launched a year after the Wii U with dramatically more powerful hardware, robust online ecosystems, and aggressive multi-platform third-party support. They understood the market was moving toward digital distribution and persistent online services. The Wii U's first-year sales were dismal, 3.5 million units. By year 2, Nintendo had slashed the price and still couldn't move inventory. Retailers began reducing shelf space. Developers cancelled announced projects. And the gamepad, the very feature meant to justify the entire platform, was barely used even by Nintendo themselves. Here's the brutal reality. Protecting your hardware moat only works if players value hardware differentiation. In 2012, they didn't. They valued ecosystems, digital libraries, multi-platform friends lists, and powerful specs for third-party blockbusters. Nintendo had optimized for a threat that no longer existed: hardware commoditization, whilst ignoring the actual threat: platform irrelevance. The layer they'd reinforced was the wrong one: the switch correction. By 2017, Nintendo's market cap had recovered slightly, but the company was in crisis. They'd just posted their first annual loss in decades. The Wii U had been quietly discontinued. Mobile gaming was still growing. And then they did something remarkable. They learned from the failure. The Switch wasn't a rejection of hardware differentiation. It was a recognition that differentiation had to serve player behavior, not protect Nintendo's business model. The Switch's core innovation, play anywhere, same game, no compromises, solved an actual player problem. It didn't require developers to build custom features. It didn't add cost for the sake of uniqueness. It didn't trap players on the sofa. More importantly, Nintendo relaxed their grip. They embraced digital distribution. They courted indie developers with developer-friendly policies. They let third parties release multi-platform games without demanding exclusive features. They even partnered with mobile developers and released their own IP on smartphones: Pokemon Go, Mario Run, Fire Emblem Heroes. The Switch proved you could maintain hardware exclusivity, keeping Mario and Zelda locked to your platform, whilst adapting to market realities. You could control the ecosystem without strangling it. The market responded. Nintendo's market cap soared from $22 billion in 2016 to over $65 billion by 2021. The Switch became the third best-selling console of all time, not because Nintendo abandoned their model, because they stopped confusing protection with paralysis. The lesson. Here's the structural lesson that goes beyond Nintendo, beyond gaming, beyond hardware entirely. Power systems, whether they're platforms, businesses, institutions, or organizations, build defenses around what made them successful. That's rational. That's survival. But the moment you start optimizing for protection over adaptation, you're building fragility into the structure itself. The Wii U failed because every layer of Nintendo's incentive stack, margins, control, identity, leadership risk, pointed toward defending yesterday's advantage. The gamepad wasn't designed to delight players. It was designed to justify hardware exclusivity in a market that no longer cared. That's not stupidity. That's what happens when your organizational structure can't process threats that contradict its foundational assumptions. You see this pattern everywhere. Blockbuster protected late fees whilst Netflix built streaming. BlackBerry protected physical keyboards whilst the iPhone defined touch. Kodak protected film whilst digital photography destroyed them. The companies that survive aren't the ones with the strongest defenses. They're the ones that know which layer to protect and which layer to let evolve. Nintendo survived because they eventually recognized that hardware could still be differentiated, but only if differentiation served player needs, not corporate anxiety. They kept control of their IP. They kept their hardware exclusivity. but they stopped confusing control with rigidity. Sometimes the strongest position is knowing when to adapt the structure, rather than defending it until it breaks.